Thank you all for coming today. It's tough coming at noon on Fridays when we want to get out of school, but appreciate y'all being here. This is Mr. Ilya Shapiro. He's our speaker today. He is a senior fellow in constitutional studies and editor-in-chief of the CATO Supreme Court Review. Before joining CATO, he was a special assistant advisor to a multinational force in Iraq on rule of law issues and practiced international and political litigation with Patton Boggs. Mr. Shapiro writes the Dispatches from Purple America column for PCSDaily.com and has written for the LA Times, Washington Times, Weekly Standard, National Review Online, and other publications. Before entering private practice, Mr. Shapiro clerked the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit while living in Mississippi and traveling around the Deep South. He holds degrees from Princeton University, London School of Economics, and the University of Chicago, and is an adjunct professor at George Washington University Law School. Mr. Shapiro is a native speaker of English, Russian, and is fluent in Spanish, French, and is proficient in Italian and Portuguese. Without further ado, Mr. Shapiro.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I always, well, who doesn't love coming to New Orleans? It's my first time actually inside Loyola, so it's neat to get a little tour. I talked to your dean a little while ago. Never get surprised at what you can encounter in New Orleans. And have a law school dean here who's an Australian Jew is kind of neat. Well, originally when we were talking about what I would talk when I was here, I thought, well, I'm doing research on foreign and international law and how that interacts with constitutional interpretation and adjudication generally. So we're talking about that, and then I mentioned that I can say a few words about my time in Iraq as well. I spent there this summer. I've given a couple of talks on that informally, and Ryan jumped all over that, and all of a sudden my talk is on how I spent my summer vacation. So I'm happy to do that. It's much easier for me, and probably more interesting for you than if I went on a highly theoretical disposition on international law and how it applies. And I think you had a speaker about that last year as well. So I spent July and August based in Baghdad, traveling around with my job as a rule of law advisor to General Petraus and the military lawyers. I don't recommend for your next vacation to Iraq that you choose the same months. I would recommend maybe January, February, when it's a little bit cooler. There are 3 seasons in Iraq, really: summer, sand, and oven. They're right for oven. It was 130 degrees for weeks on end, and we had a cool spell once. I walked out, I'm like, oh, am I adjusting or something? No, the weather the temperature dropped to 110 that day. So. But it's really impressive. I mean, this is one of the challenges, obviously, of working in this environment. You get off the plane. I mean, I got some training at Fort Benning in Georgia, and then, which was obviously hot in and of itself, but then land in Kuwait, and they give you some more information whenever you put on this military flight, the C-130. Eventually you get to Baghdad after not having slept for a day and a half. You're doing these evasive maneuvers in the plane as it corkscrews down and lands. And then you step out, and at this time of year at least, the brightness and the heat just hits you. It's hard to describe. It's like I'm wearing my Army issue or Army regulation sunglasses that are meant to protect your eyes if there's a fire nearby or whatever. But it's so bright and it's so hot, and you're walking there with at that point, whenever you're doing any sort of travel like that, you have all your armor on. That's about 70 pounds worth of stuff, your helmet and all that. And here I am, my first experience with the military, really. Arrive in Baghdad, and I'm thinking, what the heck did I get myself into? But I was met by the chief warrant officer, the chief administrator of the staff judge advocate's office, who's the head military lawyer in Iraq. A guy by the name of Colonel Mark Martins, who's just a testament to military exceptionalism. I mean, he was first in his class at West Point and at Harvard Law School, Rhodes Scholar, just tremendous. General Petraus as well, has a PhD from Princeton. That's how I met him actually at an alumni conference there. And both these guys, Colonel Martins and General Petraus, can just they'll beat their young 20-year-old recruits at running 5 miles or whatever we do. That was probably the toughest part of my job, actually. I had to run with my boss, Colonel Martins, a couple of times a week at 0500. When it cooled down, it was only about 98, 99 degrees at that time. Remarkable people that I encountered, Army lawyers and other people in various positions up and down the ranks. So what was I doing there? My job was kind of threefold. Part was as a technical legal advisor, as the most purely lawyerly aspect to my job. I'd get an email from Colonel Martins at whatever time of day with questions from, should we really be doing rule of law work in Iraq, to the most technical, what's the significance of organizing the court structure this way, or under Iraqi criminal procedure, how can we organize this for this project that we're doing? Things like that, a technical advisor. And then it was part liaison in the rule of law community, because of course it's not just the Defense Department, not just the military lawyers that are doing this important work, it's also the State Department and the Justice Department. And of course, as a civilian who was just temporarily there, I didn't have a dog in the fight, so I was kind of an innocuous player and could do that liaising role among the, as you would expect, competing agencies of the U.S. government. And you also get to learn about the various bureaucratic pathologies of each agency. So, for example, the State Department likes to talk and talk and talk and talk around an issue, and kind of frustrating. Nothing tends to get done. The Justice Department, again, as you'd expect, just over-lawyers everything. Throws, way too many lawyered things at issues rather than sometimes you need just common sense or political or some other type of solution. And the Defense Department, they don't have those problems. They're very goal-oriented, and it's obviously not hardly that many lawyers, but it's much more regimented. So if the solution to a given problem or to subparts of a problem doesn't fit into a neat box, then there might be some hassles with getting that effective. But anyhow, all of this sort of comes together, and we have this really important rule of law work that we're doing there. And I say it's important not just because it's a new priority that General Petraus put in when he took over as part of the surge, although that gives it the significance that it has now, but also because once you get the security component down, once it's safe to go to certain places, the next step in terms of social revitalization, rebuilding, is the rule of law. Because until you have a situation where people can plan their affairs and businesses can plan their affairs in the future, knowing what the rules of the game are, you're not going to have much commercial activity, you're not going to have civil society, and people are going to be afraid to hear the knock on the door in the middle of the night of the secret police. The state might be acting arbitrarily. So it's very important that you implement a system. Going back to first principles of political theory, not just legal theory. You need to have laws that have been passed by a representative body that are enforced equally by the enforcement, by the executive branches of government, and that are reviewed and applied independently by the judiciary. You don't have to have, and most countries don't have a system like the United States in terms of its institutional design and the presidential structure and all of that. And we certainly aren't there to design their political or legal institutions in that way. But what we are there for is to ensure that these basic principles of liberty and equality under the law, the elimination of arbitrary and capricious bureaucratic rule, using the procedures and the codes and the criminal procedure rules for trials that are already there. There's very little that the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA under Paul Bremer, or any of the advisors, General Petraus, General Casey, the military or the ambassadors on the State Department side have done in terms of actually dictating or enforcing or even strongly recommending substantive changes in the law. It's been much more, here are your rules. I mean, they're not bad. You know, they had to create a new constitution, which was obviously a wholly Iraqi endeavor with consultation from with consultants from different countries around the world. But in a sense, we're just there to help them along their path on normalizing and regularizing their rule of law that, you know, exists on paper, more or less. And rule of law, that this is the other component of the surge and the new strategy that we've put in. Rule of law is hugely important to any counterinsurgency effort. And General Petraus literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency. There's a new Army Marine manual on counterinsurgency warfare that was revised, totally rewritten by him and a counterpart in the Marine Corps that hadn't been revised since the early part of the Vietnam War. And so this new strategy that we've put in terms of holding, clearing and then holding and then having troops actually stationed in the problematic zones to show that we're not going anywhere, whereas before we would clear an area and then clear out and the bad guys would come back. So, you know, that from a security perspective, but also from a rule of law perspective, there's a shift in priorities and a shift in how we go about doing things. So, to sum up these basic first principles, rule of law is just as important, and in fact is a precursor to all of these other types of development work, our agriculture, industry, commerce. This is, you know, legal development work. And as someone who's studied comparative law and comparative constitutionalism and all these issues from a political and a legal perspective and worked on the policy somewhat, it was a tremendously fascinating opportunity for me, and kind of they threw me in the deep end because I kind of had this ad hoc, you know, special assistant role. You know, I kind of found my way around to see where I could be of most help. The start of rule of law, especially in a place like Iraq, was with the criminal justice system. Because if you have criminals running around not getting prosecuted, again, people can't plan their lives. And at the same time, if people are being arbitrarily prosecuted or persecuted, you know, same problem. There's a decline in the respect for the rule of law. The government is delegitimized, and you know, you have you know, feudalism or anarchy or whatever types of autocratic rule that is not what needed to develop the society economically and socially. And the three prongs, or the three legs of the rule of law stool, are the police, the courts, and the jails. And this is what our rule of law efforts over there are primarily concerned with, advising these three areas, making sure that the jails that have been set up are to international standards, you know, all of these considerations. Right when I got there, I think it was maybe 2 months before, this new project called a Rule of Law Complex in Rusafa, which is the historic center of police training in Iraq and in Baghdad, across the river from the Green Zone. This had just come online, and this was wholly funded by the Iraqi government. Security was contracted by the Iraqi government. They picked their security contractors that were handling it. There were judges there. There's a Red Cross international standard holding facility for now. There's up to, I think, 7,000 detainees. In fact, that's the problem. The surge has been so successful, and that kind of aspect of rule of law has been more successful that there's a backlog in processing these casements. And I mean for arraignment. I don't mean for trial or housing them after they've been convicted. So all in this one place, there's the traditional home of the police academy. There's a new court. Right now it's temporary. They're refurbishing an old building that's going to be the new courthouse there, and this prison. And it's all kind of an emergency, what's called an emergency branch of the Central Criminal Court of Iraq, the CCCI. And again, all of this is run by Iraqis. If there are people who are detained, enemy combatants, terror suspects, common criminals, even if they're detained by the coalition forces, there's certain procedures. The most dangerous ones tend to be sent to what's kind of a no man's land. They're not POWs because the term prisoner of war has certain legal connotations, but it's like what a prisoner of war camp would have been if we were fighting a regularized army. And there's a huge tent city prison in the south of Iraq, housing probably about 25,000 detainees by now, on the border with Kuwait. And actually, the surveying down there has been well, problematic, so there's some issue as to whether part of the camp might be in Kuwait itself, which raises other interesting international law issues that I won't get into. But in terms of the CCCI, the Central Criminal Court of Iraq, the way that the system works, when a suspect, when somebody's arrested and the decision is made that rather than being held as enemy combatant type of thing, either by the coalition or by the Iraqi security forces, they're going to be put into the criminal justice system. First, there's an investigation that's conducted by police investigators, PIs, and judicial investigators, JIs. And actually, probably the weakest part in the court system is at this level here, at the investigatory level, because there's not enough of these PIs and JIs, there's insufficient training, there's insufficient resources, and it's tough because a lot of people just get arrested and scooped up without any evidence, without witnesses who want to come forward. And of course there's a sectarian problem in Baghdad especially, where if the JI or the PI is Shia and the suspect is picked up in a Sunni area, well, that investigation is not going to go very far. And I should add as an aside here that you hear a lot about these sectarian problems, Sunni, Shia, with the Kurds in the north. That's a big issue in Baghdad. In other places, tribalism is actually more prevalent or salient, an issue for good and ill, than sectarianism. And in fact, there's a lot of tribes that have both Sunni and Shia, and even some Kurds in them. So for example, you hear about the clearing of Anbar, where the Sunni sheiks turned, now they're working with the coalition forces, or you hear about more recently Diyala province, where a similar thing has happened with Al-Qaeda on the run, and the sheiks have turned. They're not religious leaders there like Muqtada al-Sadr, who are commanding religiously based or sectarian based militias. It's all different tribes which kind of function as blood-based political parties almost. Nothing to do with ideology, it's just family loyalty and allegiance based on these historic tribal ties. So just in terms of keep in mind when you're reading news reports about problems with sectarianism, it's a much bigger deal in Baghdad and certain other parts of certain other huge cities, or the biggest cities, but most other places tribalism is a bigger aspect of Iraqi life and the Iraqi legal system. So anyway, the CCCI, or any criminal procedure, criminal court. Once these investigations are concluded, there's a hearing. It's called an investigative hearing before an investigative judge. This again is an inquisitorial system, so it's not common law. You don't have adversaries competing as we're used to. I mean, here in New Orleans, you might be somewhat familiar with the civil law system, but not so much at the criminal stage, I don't think. But there, it's an inquisitorial system for criminal law as well. So you have this investigative hearing. I went to a couple of them that Army JAGs were involved in, so they acted like the investigators, and they collected evidence. Typically the statements would come from the soldiers that picked up these guys, these suspects, and they would take pictures of the mortars or the stash of weapons or whatever the case may be about, and documented where they arrested him. Prepared this kind of almost a pretrial memo, you could say, and presented that during this investigative hearing. This takes place kind of like in an office. It's not so much a court, but each of the judges has his chambers essentially. They're like a typical office. They're comfortable. They're not certainly lavish. The judge comes in, not in robes, just sits there at his desk, chain smoking away. They bring the suspect in, dressed in orange with flip-flops, sits on the couch. There's, it's an office. There's couches. There's office chairs and such. Guarded by a security official, in this case, an American soldier. Then the JAG presents his case, or rather, the judge asks the JAG questions about, how do you develop this evidence? Can I see this? Can I see that? He looks at that, and from time to time, he dictates a summary of the evidence as he sees it to his scribe. There's, a 20-something guy, maybe in law school, working a second job, or just some of these guys are just professional clerks, and literally taking down the information the judge dictates to them about the evidence that the judge is witnessing and hearing. The judge then questions the witnesses. In this case, this one case that I'm specifically talking about, there were two soldiers that picked up someone in a case involving mortars that were being fired at a coalition force embedded position, and they tracked down these mortars to this one neighborhood, and then found out the center of it was coming from this one house. So they searched a bunch of houses, and they focused on this one, and they found a stash of mortar launchers, and they arrested the guy who was living there. His story, by the way, is that he had only been living there for about a week. This house had been provided to him by the JAM, which is one of the Shia militias, after they had cleared the neighborhood of all the Sunni families, and they had, he was from the provinces, and he just came to kind of like a mutual aid society, and they said, okay, well, you can have this house to live here. I don't know anything about the mortars. I saw them, but I didn't touch them. That was his story. And so we went to this, the hearing's ongoing. The whole thing lasted about 45 minutes to an hour. And at one point, one of the soldiers who was testifying talked about how the mortar launcher was in such and such a condition, and I could tell that it had been fired in the last day or so, and it fires the exact type of shells that have been hitting us, etc., etc. And the defense counsel has the right to cross-examine. Well, if the judge allows, typically the judge allows the cross-examination. But this is a fairly new exercise of powers. Previously, even when there was a defense counsel, this person would essentially be a potted plant, observing things. I'm not exactly sure why, but as I was told, they didn't really play any role whatsoever. Certainly not at the investigative hearing. A little bit more at the trial. So this defense counsel, I think, spoke maybe twice during the entire hearing. One of them was to ask this question of this soldier who just testified, and she asked him, so, yeah, it's a woman. A lot of these court-appointed defense counsels are women. It's kind of interesting. They wear the hijab, but there's a lot of female lawyers in Iraq. And she asked, so how did you know that this mortar launcher was in good operating condition and fairly new and had been recently fired? And, how do you know so much about the mortar launcher? And the soldier, who's all 19, 20 years old, kind of like gives a sheepish grin and turns to look at her and says, well, ma'am, I'm a mortarman. So that's his specialty in the Army, to look specifically after mortars and mortar launchers. And now this is kind of telling, because you can see that this is a new part of or a newly used part of the Iraqi criminal justice system, because you'll find as you go off and, unless Las Vegas works for you, you're going to be doing your legal practice, you never go into a trial or a deposition or a witness examination not knowing the answers to your question. You just don't ask questions that you don't know the answers to, and certainly not ones that the answer could be bad for your case. So that was a little, I had to stifle a little chuckle at that. So anyway, that was the investigation. The judge kept dictating this whole thing, and then the detainee, the suspect, gave his side of the story as well, and he was questioned, and that was it. And the judge made his, dictated his summary. Apparently, his recommendation was that the suspect be held over for trial, and that there was I forget what the technical legal term is, because of course, this is all in Arabic, we were doing a translation, but essentially it was like a magistrate's report recommending conviction. Oh, and a side note about like I said, this all goes in this handwritten scribe thing with carbon copy, eight copies of this stuff. And one of the kind of another just amusing anecdote about this whole situation about reconstituting the criminal justice system, or courts in general. When the JAGs first came in, I mean, first of all, the JAGs were expecting most of their training had been on refugee law and setting up refugee camps and how do you deal with displaced people and whatever. Because this is what they thought would be the biggest challenge when the forces came in to overthrow Saddam. That obviously didn't happen. I mean, there are refugees in Syria and other places that are being dealt with in other ways, but they're not under coalition control. But we want to reconstitute the courts to get this whole rule of law thing up and running for the reasons that I said earlier. And they found that they didn't have carbon paper. They couldn't find it. And of course, the younger JAGs, they're fresh out of law school, 25, 26, 27 years old. They never heard of carbon paper. So luckily, we had this coalition, and we were able to find, with the help of our Romanian and Polish friends, some warehouses in the former communist countries that had carbon paper from that era, and they helped us out bringing some to Iraq. So anyway, that's the investigative hearing. From that, it proceeded to trial. I didn't see the trial in that case because it takes a while to, you don't go straight to trial after one hearing like that. I saw a different trial in a case involving where 6 provincial policemen, and you have to make the distinction between federal and provincial police because the federal ones are much better trained under Department of Justice and other international auspices. They have better resources. They're less corrupt. There's less sectarian problems in them. There still is all of, relatively speaking, I'm saying, than the provincial police, which are just a complete mixed bag from, no different from armed militias to actually real police. Anyway, these 6 provincial police were charged with kidnap and murder of a couple of people. The interesting thing was no body was found, no blood was found. It was all kind of this circumstantial evidence with an eyewitness from kind of far away, and the person who disappeared. And interesting kind of story. We came into this big courtroom, and a trial under the Iraqi system takes place with 3 judges, so it's like an appellate panel here. They have reviewed the report that the investigative judge made to them. Then they hear from, he's called the prosecutor, but he's not really the prosecutor. He's more like an ombudsman or a representative of Iraqi law, almost like a second magistrate judge or something. Basically makes a recommendation saying, I have studied the law, I've studied the facts, I've studied the investigative report, and this is my conclusion. So in this case, the prosecutor, ombudsman figure, recommended acquittal. He said that given the facts, I can't remember what the exact his technical reasoning is, but essentially the case fell between having enough evidence for either the first charge that they were charged with or the other one, and something like that. Okay. After that, the defense counsel spoke and gave a more impassioned, fact-based argument, less about the law and more about there's not enough facts to prove this, there's not enough facts to prove this, these people, it's just a mistaken identity, these people are good cops, etc., etc. And then the courts said, okay, we'll take that under advisement. So, they kind of didn't recess really, they just kind of sat there talking amongst themselves on the bench. Meanwhile, the accused were in the dock, all 6 of them in this wooden dock. They talked amongst themselves for about 5 minutes. This whole proceeding lasted maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then they banged the gavel, reconvened, called the session back to order. The chief judge pronounced guilty, and then the chief judge pronounced death. And that was the trial. It followed Iraqi criminal procedure. It was fully transparent. It went through this whole investigative process. It went through the trial process, and presumably those people were executed 2 weeks to 2 months later. And that's the general time frame for fairly straightforward cases that didn't have political exigencies or things like this. So that's the Iraqi criminal justice system in action. The problems come in, again, as I mentioned, with the treatment of detainees. Not in the sense of them being abused, although that happens as well in some jails that the Iraqis control, that the coalition forces and advisors and consultants just don't approach, don't have anything to deal with. But as I said, some of these people come in with no evidence, and it's difficult to sort through. And you run into this problem where not only do you have terrorists or very bad criminals in with the general population who are converting people to their cause perhaps, or otherwise harming the environment on the one hand, and on the other hand you have people who I mean, I'm sure there's some completely innocent people as well, but a more common case would be someone who's picked up for a more minor violation. Maybe a curfew violation, that's the most minor thing. Maybe just, whatever, theft or whatever it is, but they languish in these detention facilities for longer than what the sentence would be, the prison sentence would be for someone convicted under that, the maximum sentence convicted under that, for that crime. And of course, both of these situations cause the population to lose confidence in the courts, in the rule of law. So that's obviously a huge problem. And this is why we, meaning the American military and State Department and Justice Department officials and the coalition advisors, a lot of Australian JAGs are helping with this effort, and British as well, have been pushing for just get these people processed, do something, or if they're enemy combatants, to use the language that the Supreme Court's going to be taking up, and the courts in this country have been dealing with. If they're enemy combatants, fine, and process them separately, and we have those procedures, fine. But you've already made the determination that these people are not bad. They're not going to be treated in that way. They're you're going to put them through the criminal justice system. Fine, well, let's do it. And you run into, there's a lot of frustrating things, from debates over jurisdiction and venue, like the one chief judge at this rule of law complex. It's very interesting, actually. I was there when the Minister of Human Rights was touring the facility. And she observed this tent city of prisons. And again, there's air conditioning, there's enough space per person. You can imagine these huge tents for about 16, 20 people each. Like I said, air conditioned enough, they have hygienic facilities and all the rest of it, but just going on for rows and rows and rows. Toured that, and then went to talk to the chief judge and was like, so why aren't you processing these people? And he kind of hemmed and hawed, and one of the things he raised was venue. He's like, well, these people, they were brought over from that district and this district. I'm here in Rusafa. We can only handle these people. Those people are Hark people. Those people are Adamia people. And she was like, she essentially looked at him and was like, are you kidding me? I mean, they're parked right here. We need to deal with it. You have the resources. And it was fascinating to watch. It went on for 20, 30 minutes. I think we had to delay our helicopter, because of course for all business meetings you have to go either by helicopter or by armored convoy to get back to the ministry buildings. While she harangued this chief judge to say, look, if you've got terrorists, try them, convict them. If you don't, let these people go. And it was kind of neat to observe. So that is a jurisdictional issue. There's also a work ethic or a work culture issue, for good and ill. So the judges don't like to, their average work day is maybe 10 to 2 with a tea break in there somewhere. We're trying to train these PIs and these JIs, the investigators, who bear the brunt of getting all this evidence up so we can actually do these trials, that are these arraignments and investigative hearings and all this. We don't have enough of them. Now, finally, we have enough resources, both committed by the Iraqi government and supplied as aid by the U.S. and coalition governments. But this training course lasts about 6 weeks. We found out that the classes were only being given 9 to 12. I'm like, oh, well, we can just, we have more space, so we'll expand the classrooms, and we'll just have them go 9 to 5, and we'll complete the course in 3 weeks. It'll be so much faster. We'll turn out these investigators. No, that was not going to happen. Going 9 to 5 is just, the Iraqi equivalent of cruel and unusual punishment. Something. But like I said, it works both ways. So in the green zone in the embassy complex where I was living in a trailer. It was pretty safe. You're protected from shrapnel or whatever, so the only way you can really get hurt is if the mortar or the rocket, they get launched about 2 or 3 times a day, hit your trailer dead on, like a direct hit. But the bad guys, they need their rest as well. So you never see any of these mortars or rockets fired between about 11 p.m. or 7 a.m., which is the only time when people are in their trailers and thereby vulnerable. So you have trailers blown up from time to time, but this whole year I think we're up to about 42 or 45 deaths in the entire green zone from these rocket attacks, which, given that there have been 1,200 of these attacks or something, it's not bad. The closest I came, by the way, to any harm that way, I think there was a rocket that hit a trailer 3 away from mine my last week there. But I was safely at the office, which is fully, the presidential palace, which is fully safe. As is the dining hall, as is the gym, as is anywhere else you go. And then the bad guys, I guess, decided it was too hot for them or something, and they just declared a moratorium for a couple of months. Like I said, it works both ways. Let's see. So that detainee issue remains. You hear a lot about improvements that are being made, and they are. There's more trials that are being processed. There's even starting to be intersectarian trials, meaning a Shia judge will convict now a Shia policeman. They won't protect them that way. That's happened. These sorts of things. It's slowly building, and the communities are regaining or gaining their trust in the justice system. And the interesting thing about this is that under Saddam, the criminal justice system, the courts, were one of the least corrupted aspects of the regime. They didn't have enough resources. He starved them of money and resources and all that. But the courts were so, in a relative sense, incorruptible that he had to create a parallel court system for his kangaroo trials and show trials and all the rest of it. So we had a ready-made, in terms of de-Baathification that created so many problems in other areas of government, in terms of judges and lawyers, there was this whole ready stock of untainted, relatively untainted professionals that we could draw from. But very hierarchical, this level official, judicial official will not do anything unless his boss approves something, which won't do something unless his boss approves something, who won't do anything unless the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court gives the okay. And of course, once you get the Chief Justice okay to do something, then you have to get the funds from the Ministry of the Interior, who has jurisdiction over the jails and certain other things, or you have to get approval from them, and then you have to get the funds from the Ministry of Finance, who gets the funds from the oil revenues in the Ministry of Oil. So there's this whole kabuki dance that you have to constantly be doing as a rule of law advisor. You're not just dealing with the Justice Minister or the Interior Minister for jails. There's this whole thing, and the process repeats and repeats and repeats itself. You sit in some of these meetings, and another example, I met with I was part of a meeting with the Minister of Justice in early August, and we had made great progress with him in setting up a lot of these courts and things. And there was going to be a meeting the following week that combined, interministerial, combined finance and interior and State Department, Defense Department, like different people that could really help promote this rule of law effort. And so we told him about this, and we said, of course you would be, one of the most important people there. So, we hope you can come. He's like, I'm going on vacation for 3 weeks. So, but our officials go on vacation for 3 weeks as well. And a neat observation that Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator from South Carolina, made while he was there. He came in to do his JAG Reserve service while I was there. He's a JAG Reserve Colonel in the Air Force. And he was there working in my office for a couple of weeks while I was there. One interesting observation that he, as a politician, was uniquely qualified to make, and that's that, we heap scorn on the Iraqi parliamentarians for going on vacation in, this crucial time. Like, well, first of all, as I said, it's an impossible work environment, 130 degrees on end, and they haven't really, air conditioning hasn't come to all the governmental buildings. Second of all, there's very few people that, it's not like they're going on vacation to Lake Geneva or New York or something like this. They're going back to their to where they're from, to their constituencies, wherever that is. And during that time, they're going to have heard an earful from their constituents about whatever. You know, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working. So they're not going to necessarily find out what the solutions to the problem is from their constituents, but they're going to feel the heat to make actual reforms. And as we've seen, that actually has panned out a little bit. There's been some necessary legislation that's been passed, and much more progress made. Part of that is with the changing and improving security situation. But there has been more progress made than we could have expected when we were so disappointed by these people going on vacation and so forth. Let's see, I've talked quite a bit. Let me draw this to a close. The bottom line is that the situation on the ground changes week to week and month to month, so it's very hard to draw policy conclusions, a very difficult policy-making environment. The only thing that's certain is that if we leave as quickly as possible, then things will implode as quickly as possible. On the other hand, there's no guarantee that 5 or even 10 years from now, things will be a step level different. So, what do you do with that? You do the best that you can. And I think, certainly from a rule of law perspective, that General Petraus' testimony was about the right thing to say, and a good perspective and good recommendations to make. You have to observe the principle of sunk costs. I don't know how many of you took economics in college, but it's such a shame that we've wasted 3.5 years, essentially wasted 3.5 years. Right now we're doing the right thing, where we weren't before. So the question isn't whether we're doing the right thing or going about rule of law or security or what have you the right way. We pretty much are. But is it too late? Have we wasted too much time? With the principle of sunk costs, we have to evaluate based going forward, given the facts on the ground. Right now, forget who's to blame or what went wrong before, and there's plenty of that. What can we do to prevent the rule of law from falling apart or being taken over by Al-Qaeda or Iran, or as the case may be? And I think I'll leave it there. I'm happy also to take questions about foreign and international law as they apply to constitutional interpretation, which is originally what I was going to talk to. And there was a big case that was argued 3 weeks ago at the Supreme Court called Medellin versus the United States. That is kind of like a law school exam. Combines federalism and executive authority, criminal procedure, all these different things. Very convoluted case that I was involved in preparing the Solicitor General of Texas for his argument before the court in that. But anyhow, I'll leave it there, and happy to talk about whatever you want. Yeah?
We have this professor who likes to talk about how much Iraq has no experience with rule of law, constitutional democracy, and how what we're doing is basically a waste of time and we're going to fail. Has that been your experience with how everyday Iraqis are?
Well, you heard of Hammurabi? He was the original lawgiver. He was from Mesopotamia. Iraqis instinctively understand legal processes. They're business people, They want their disputes resolved quickly. They have a very stern and harsh thought about criminality. If you're a criminal, you should, the whole system of Sharia law with chopping off the hand when you're a thief, or all these type of things that we consider barbaric, that existed there for a long time under both religious and secular rule. And in fact, even now, the civil courts work, pretty well. There are problems with getting electricity to them and these other logistical concerns. But if you're a small business owner in, let's say, Basra, and you have a contract with another small business owner to provide you with whatever it is, and that person breached the contract and you sue them, your case is going to be resolved in probably about a month or two, which is obviously much faster than here. they have no patience for having these disputes linger. They want these things resolved, whether by tribal council or by government. But either way, there's a system. There's this long-held cultural value of deciding disputes in a neutral way. I mean, there's certain considerations that go into that, like honor and how do we, this is a long-term process. We can't humiliate this person because he's going to have to do business with this person again later and in the community, whatever. So there's all these other types of considerations. But, when you say that there's never been rule of law in Iraq, it's like, well, we're not trying to put in an American or a German or a Singaporean system. And like I said, we're not being cultural paternalists and saying, our way is the only right way, or pick us or the Europeans, one of the two. No, we're not doing that. It's condescending to say that you people just don't deserve or can't figure out how to do rule of law. The problems that they're having are not because rule of law is not something that they value. It's because Saddam warped the society and the rulers before him, and in some part our maladministration as well. After we,
What's the presumption of guilt or innocence in the criminal system, and then what level of proof do you hold the defendant to?
I don't think it works in terms of presumptions as we think about them here. Burden of proof, burden of persuasion, presumption of innocence or preponderance. These standards, they work a little bit differently. It's kind of like, and I'm a little fuzzy on the exact technical details, but the judge hears all this evidence. Well, first the investigative judge and then trial judges, and then they kind of rule in the interest of justice. Is this? I don't think. I mean, they don't enunciate beyond a shadow of doubt. They don't enunciate preponderance of the evidence. It's a little bit fuzzy, and they have it's almost like a common law evolution from the civil law about they have these understandings about, well, clearly this is sufficient proof or this isn't. But I didn't encounter, and I could be wrong, I just didn't look enough at the technical Iraqi opinions, and they're not so much opinions because the opinions aren't really written other than like a one-page paragraph summarizing the disposition. But it's I think it's fuzzy. Yes.
I wanted to ask you if you knew why or whether prior to Saddam, so this would maybe be shortly after the British rule in Iraq had ended, so post-World War II up to maybe early 1970. What did their criminal and civil courts look like then? Do we know? How did they function? Where it seemed like there would have been more common law influence from the British being there for so long. And so if there was a sort of parallel court system, was that a holdover from the British administration, or do you know?
I think the British put in some common law for commercial disputes,
Mm-hmm.
although again it was more like, here's our codes, and then kind of there was common law interpretations that emerged out of that.
Out of the way they interpreted it? Or
Right,
applied?
right,
Mm-hmm.
right. But since the formation of Iraq and during the previous administration, they always adhered more towards the continental European system, the inquisitorial system.
Is that more compatible with their traditional tribal ways of
I think
settling
so,
disputes?
and I think so because, that's the other thing. They still resolved a much greater proportion of their disputes in the traditional ways. You
Alternative dispute resolution.
Right, exactly, exactly. And it's because the traditional way, you have one tribal elder or a council, or depending on how big the case was, asking parties questions, probing and getting evidence, and that's close to what the civil system is. Yeah.
How much of the problem is like stemming from Iranian influence, and what do you think needs to be done about that? I mean, are they the major cause of most of the problems going on right now?
Well, that's a little out of my bailiwick. I mean, it's more of a security issue. It's not like they have Iranian lawyers trying to impose anything. So even if I did have special knowledge about that, it would be classified, so I probably couldn't do it. But I mean, yeah, there's evidence of, and you've seen an increasing shift in our efforts, especially as the Shia militias have kind of declared a moratorium for a few months, that our focus has been in trying to deter the flow of weapons and other disruptive material from Iran. There's some evidence that that has decreased. I think there hasn't actually been a mortar fired at the embassy complex in almost a month, but they don't know whether that's because of our efforts, whether security or military or diplomatic, or just because the Iranians are pursuing a different strategy.
If Iranian, like Revolutionary Guard, for instance, were arrested in Iraq, does Iraq contact Iran? They have one of their citizens.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Vienna Convention, the consular protections are really observed. No, they're Iraqi. I don't. The thing, because these people aren't, even the Revolutionary Guard. I mean, there are people that are picked up, but they dress as, to blend in. They're not wearing uniforms, so it's no different than a random, Syrian or Saudi jihadist getting picked up. I haven't heard of, troops in uniform being arrested. It's a delicate relationship because, Iran's Shia and Iraq is majority Shia, the government is majority Shia. But of course Iraq is Arab and Iran is Persian. What gets lost in all this discussion of, Iraq's just going to be an Iranian puppet, or there's more influence that way, is that historically there's been more tension and fighting between, like the Arab-Persian difference has been a much more salient one than the Shia-Sunni one. It's only with the rise of Wahhabi Sunnism on the Arabian Peninsula that the Shia-Sunni rift has really developed. So a lot of the Iraqi Shias are very wary of Iran and Iranian influence, and you don't have to go back farther than the Iran-Iraq War. Most of the ground troops that were fighting that on the Iraqi side, and willingly, patriotically, were Shia.
Is that it?
Would you go back again?
Well, General Petraus asked me to. It's hard to say no to him. We'll see what happens. If I do, it won't be during July and August. If I can have any control over that.
Any more questions? I want to thank Mr. Shapiro for coming down here.